President Trump defending his plan for what he calls extreme vetting of some people trying to come to the U.S. And it's time now for our Sunday group. GOP strategist Karl Rove, Charles Lane of the Washington Post, Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press, and Dana Perino, co-host of The Five. Well, Karl, let's start with you. What do you make of the president's order restricting people coming to this country from largely Muslim nations and the federal judges, a couple of federal judges getting involved?
Well, look, he promised this during the campaign, extreme vetting. But I think people might have been surprised. I think that they might have been led to believe that rather than suspending the issuance of new visas, they didn't expect him to turn back people who already had visas, including people who had green cards. And that's how the federal judges got involved.
No, we should explain that. So you got a green card. You're a permanent resident in this country, legal resident in this country. You've gone on a trip someplace else. Now you can't get back in.
Or you have received a visa approved by the United States government in the recent past, and you got on an airplane and showed up at the airport, and suddenly that visa, which had been given to you by the United States government, is no longer legitimate and valid.
Donald Trump would say, too bad.
Not too bad. Well, but a federal judge said you could cause irreparable harm. In fact, one of the first people who had such a visa who was stopped at the New York airport, as luck would have it, is somebody who worked for the U.S. government in Iraq for the last 10 years. Not exactly, if you want to have a long, happy life, a good thing to do in Iraq. So, look, the president's following through on his commitment, but it strikes me that it might have been better. He wants the Secretary of the Homeland Security and the Secretary of State in the next 30 days to come up with the information that they need, and those two plus the Director of National Intelligence and the FBI Director in the next 60 days to come up with a plan for extreme vetting. It might have been better to say suspend the issuance of any new visas, rigorously monitor people who come into the country from these 7 countries who have a visa or permanent residents who come back in the country, and then in 90 days we have a complete new plan that we can then begin issuing new visas.
Chuck, as we say, this is already in the courts, and at this point, I guess you got something like 300 people who are in kind of limbo at U.S. airports. What's the fallout both politically and legally here?
Whatever it is, it's entirely self-inflicted. This was all avoidable for the White House. They put this thing together without a full interagency process. They put it together, obviously, without thinking through the green card angle and all its potential ramifications. And they produced an order that sort of is like a lose-lose-lose for them. It's not even the full Muslim ban he promised at one point. This is the sort of climb-down position, and yet he produces something that's over-inclusive in that it brings in all the green card people, and under-inclusive in that it leaves out, as you pointed out earlier, a number of countries such as Pakistan or Afghanistan from whence terrorists have come. So obviously there's huge uproar on the Democratic side. That was predictable. But very interestingly, I counted at least 3 Republican senators who voiced concerns about how this thing has worked out. So it's not even entirely clear that he's going to have unified Republican support behind this thing unless they can clean it up very quickly.
Dana, you worked for a president who famously and very in a concentrated way made the point, we're at war with terrorism, we're not at war with Muslims. Do you worry that this ends up changing that message?
Well, I do think it's important to point out that it's a moratorium, not a ban, so there is time for them to be able to figure it out, so it's not like it's a permanent thing. I also think that some of the responses today in the explanation, like from Kellyanne Conway earlier on your show, helped explain a little bit more about the decision-making process. And when they say that this was an Obama administration recommendation, I think that would have been a helpful thing to use initially. So I call that an ounce of prevention. How can you explain things more? Because what we found, and I think President Obama found it too, is that you can't get everyone to agree with a decision, but you should be able to get them to respect the decision-making process. And I think the Trump administration would be well served if it explains things a little bit more on the front end to avoid confusion on the back end, so that more of those stories that Kellyanne Conway was talking about, the underreporting of all the good stuff, could get more play.
You know, I'm beginning to call these Trump Sundays because I prepare the show on Saturday, and by Sunday morning, the world has changed. And what I thought we were going to talk about, and now what I'm going to talk about with you, Julie, is the president's phone call with Russian President Putin yesterday, which was highly anticipated, so much so that, in fact, President Trump had to lower expectations. Here he is.
Putin and Russia, I don't say good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know the gentleman. I hope we have a fantastic relationship. That's possible, and it's also possible that we won't. We will see what happens.
Julie, have you learned anything? Because the White House has not been very forthcoming, at least publicly. Have you learned anything privately from sources about how the call went? And two, this talk about conceivably lifting sanctions, which Kelly and Conway had said was under consideration.
You're right. The readout of this call was pretty brief. Not a lot of details in there.
We actually literally got more information from the Kremlin than we did from the White House.
The Kremlin is actually quite skilled at putting out readouts, not only that are more detailed, but also that come out faster than the White House. It's a strategy that they're pretty good at. I did talk to a White House official who said that sanctions did not come up in the course of this conversation. There was a lot of talk about security issues, particularly the idea of terrorism being what Putin apparently called a common foe multiple times in the course of this conversation. I think that you should look at this 30-day review that the president has ordered the Pentagon to do on the ISIS strategy for a possible focus on coordinating more with Russia and Syria, which is something that the Obama administration resisted. But even the idea that sanctions didn't come up in this phone call doesn't ease the anxiety that you're seeing, not just among European leaders, but a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill who worry that the president, when he has to make a decision very quickly on the sanctions involving Ukraine, could look to make a deal with Russia and back off of those, and then also back off of the sanctions that Obama imposed for the hacking.
Dana, your former boss, Bush 43, famously said that he looked in the eyes, straight in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, got a sense of his soul. As we know, that didn't work out very well. How do you think this relationship with, do you think Trump can somehow charm or tame Vladimir Putin? Well,
I thought that Donald Trump's probably best moment of his week was his press conference with the UK Prime Minister Theresa May, where he talked about good, bad, or indifferent, I don't know, which is actually true. So he's not sure. He says he'd like to have a good relationship. So did the Obama administration with the famous reset button. I think
that didn't work out either.
No. So American presidents want to have good relations with countries all over the world, and then it's really up to that president or the counterpart to what their actions are. And I think the Ukraine issue, or whether there was more interference, and I think that also that Donald Trump will appreciate that Vladimir Putin has national interests of his own. He doesn't want to be friends with us because he's a friendly guy. He wants something from us, and it might be something nefarious that's not in our national interest, and so he might have to back off of it. But I think that his best moment of the week was with that moment when he answered the question in that press conference with Theresa May.